Failure. We fear it. We say, what if I fail? But failure is necessary for growth. If you're succeeding at everything, there's no way you're learning and growing. I'm Allison Stanfield, and this is the Art Biz Podcast, where I talk with dedicated artists who inspire me, and I hope inspire you with their ideas and tenacity. I've been working with today's guest in my program for the last few years, most closely when she joined my mastermind group a year ago. Laura Petrovich-Cheney is ambitious and knows what she wants, and she's not afraid to fail. In our interview, you'll hear Laura's philosophy that failure is the result of not listening to your instinct and not doing your best. This builds on what Leah Smithson was talking about in episode 94, when she said how important it was to listen to her gut to avoid what she calls disasters. We tend to sweep failures under the rug. We hope that nobody's going to see or notice and that we'll forget about them. But as you'll hear from Laura, we can't improve without examining what went wrong. Laura talks about a few failures she has learned from, why it's helpful to have a little bit of time and space before examining failures, and the shame that gets in the way of sharing failure with others. We also discuss the inevitable comparisons to other artists that arise when you fail and see only their successes. Here's my conversation with Laura Petrovich-Cheney. Hi, Laura. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Allison. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I am delighted to have you here to talk about the topic that we're going to talk about today. But before we get to that, tell everyone a little bit about your artist's journey, how you got to this point, a little bit about your art. Let's start there.
Oh my goodness. The journey's long because I'm old.
Right. You're younger than I am, so I take offense at that.
Oh boy. I started off, obviously, like most people, drawing and creating when you were younger, and it just never left me. I went to college and I had a fine arts degree in fashion drawing and figure drawing and English literature. I went on to graduate school for fashion design and was a fashion designer for about 10 years in maternity clothes, and then in New York for a while. I was an art teacher for about 15 years. And somewhere in my art teaching career, I really wanted to be a better artist and learn more about, creating from my own heart. Mm-hmm. And I went to graduate school in my mid to late 40s. And I went to Moore College of Art. And then I started constructing with wood. And now I make quilt-inspired wall sculptures using salvaged wood from natural disasters.
Quilt-inspired wall sculptures using salvaged wood from natural disasters. They're pieced. They're not just quilt-inspired. They're actually pieced like a quilt too.
Like a patchwork. If you just close your eyes and imagine, the traditional quilt log cabins, that's pretty much what I do with wood that I collected primarily after Hurricane Sandy, but after some other ones as well.
Awesome. And I learned things about you during that. A designer of maternity wear. That's fascinating. I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah, very cool. Maternity in the 90s.
Oh my gosh, that's super cool. So we should say that this conversation came about in our mastermind group because we were having this conversation. I don't even know how we got to this point. And you led this impassioned speech about failure, about the importance of failure in your practice. And I immediately said, Laura, we need to have you on the podcast to talk about this because you are really passionate about it. So before we talk about your philosophy of failure, if you can call it that, how do you define failure?
That's a really great question. One that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And failure, I think, is primarily a lack of listening to your intuition, of not trying your best. And I think the two are combined. When you do something sort of haphazardly and put together, in your heart of hearts that if it's not authentic and true to who you are, then it's not the best that you can do. Now, failure doesn't mean you're going to succeed. My dad always said, did you try your best? And if you really tried your best and you were only capable of mediocre performance, then that's still a success. The best example is I tried very hard to the best of my ability to study chemistry, and the best that I could do was pass. That was successful. So failure doesn't mean success. Failure just means not listening to your intuition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree with that. Does this philosophy does it come from somewhere or someone? Did it come from your dad?
I think from my parents, obviously, because they instill your early value systems on you, and then throughout your life, you learn your own value systems. So it's from early childhood learning and observing, but also through life experiences.
Okay. So expanding on that, was there is this a conversation you've had with anyone else? Did you have it in graduate school? Did you talk about failure as part of an artist practice? Because there's failure, as you well know, there's failure in your art practice, like not listening to that intuition, not doing the work that comes from your heart, as you said. And then there's failure in your business when you, try to sell something or market something that nobody wants, or that you're not doing the right way or something. So I'm wondering if you had this conversation in graduate school or with anyone else.
Well, yes, in graduate school, obviously. And there's
not so obviously to other people who haven't been to graduate school.
Fashion design in graduate school, where the failure was the teacher just took the work off the wall and threw it on the ground. They're failures, but they're also horrible experiences. But there's a difference between failure and mistakes. When you're trying to learn something new, like I was trying to learn encaustic materials, and there were a lot of mistakes made because it was a new process for me. And that's very different than a failure. Mistakes can be made because you lack knowledge, you lack experience, you were tired, and there's a lack of awareness that happens with a mistake because you just don't know. I think failure is defined when you do know and you don't correct it. And that's a huge difference in my mind. Like, I've made a lot of mistakes. You rush through an exam, you rush through an artwork, you rush through doing your taxes, whatever it is. And if you don't notice what you're doing because you're not paying attention, they're mistakes. But a failure is when you look at something and go, okay, I think this is not my best. And you send it out into the world anyhow. That's a failure in my mind,
Yeah.
Trying your best, not doing the research, not double checking your work, not doing what you're supposed to do, not listening to your intuition. That's a failure.
Yeah. I see that. Because as we were talking about this, I was looking at some old blog posts that I created on failure, and there was a lot of commenting and arguments, but not arguments in a bad way, or really arguments that were about semantics. And I think we can get into semantics. So we've used the word success and failure and mistakes. I was thinking earlier today, before we talked, I was thinking of failures as progress. Because how we, in our mastermind, we celebrate failures because we're like, yay, get it out of the way. And so I think that, it's so funny because we can't make progress without the failures.
Correct. And failures are noticed over time. Like when we had that conversation in the mastermind class, I was thinking specifically of my failure not to have gotten into a particular residency, and I've tried, that was my third time that I tried. And I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And when I go back in months later to examine the application, and it's still too fresh in my mind to look at it right now. But I know when I go back and re-examine the application, those failures will be obvious. Maybe I didn't research it enough. Maybe I needed to have more clarity. Maybe I needed to have a professional editor look at my application. If it's that high level, why didn't I maybe send it out to an editor to have it professionally looked over? Why didn't I do the application 2 months in advance and talk to somebody else or interview somebody that has gone there so that I have an idea? And that's what I mean by failure and not trusting your intuition. You only notice it after the fact. And that's what makes them so painful.
Because you can't do anything about it.
Correct. And it's, when something really matters, like getting into that residency, it's tied up in you emotionally. So it's hard to examine what you're doing objectively. And that's why I think that can be a failure. It's so hard to remove yourself from that kind of clarity that you need to see, where am I? Is it an overreach for me to try to do this? Should I wait another 2 years when I have more successes under my belt to apply? And it's hard to know those things. And it's hard to really examine where you're at with the skill level you have and determine where you need to go. So
what do you do?
You just keep doing it. And you go back and look at those failures. Yeah. And, a really good one happened in 2012. I had a solo exhibit at in Abington Arts Center in Pennsylvania. And it was my first solo exhibit outside of graduate school. And I had photographed my own work. And I know I'm not a good photographer. I knew that. But we'd been encouraged to do a lot of DIY, do your own photographs. You have the capability, here's how you do it. So I did. And I looked at those images and I thought, they're okay. I could put them on Photoshop and clean them up. Well, I didn't really know Photoshop that well either. So, I'm kind of fooling myself a little bit, but I knew they weren't good images. So I submitted them anyhow to a fellowship residency, and I didn't get in. And I was very disappointed in that. And I had written to you about something, and you had asked me to send images because you would have liked to have featured my work on the blog. And when you saw my images, you said, these are not great. You need.
Oh, really?
Yes, that was so funny. It was the first lesson I learned with you.
That's
so it was the first lesson that I learned. You're like, your images aren't great. You should really get them done professionally. But I knew that, and I didn't pay to have them done, and I did them myself. And I kind of, when you really are honest with yourself, you can go back and say, yeah, there it was. That's when I failed. So I hired a professional photographer. They came to my house. They photographed all my work. I resubmitted them a year later to that residency fellowship. I got accepted, and then I resubmitted them to you later too, and they were published on your blog. So, yeah, I
don't publish bad photos. I just
and you told me so, but that was a failure on my part because I didn't listen to what was right, and I wasn't hearing myself. And that's what I mean by it's not listening to your intuition. If you really sit down and look objectively, you can figure it out. And sometimes that doesn't happen for a couple years later. And it's living with that failure. That
we really learn this. I think another failure is not learning from those failures. Like you said, you go back and look at it later. You said now is too soon, but go back and look at it later, which I totally get because it's so fresh. You didn't write it that long ago, and you aren't objective. But failing to do that, failing to learn from that experience is another failure, right? It's still, it's more of a failure than the original, in fact.
Correct. And it's really a challenge because when failure is so tied up with shame and humiliation. Mm-hmm. And to really look at yourself as not being perfect or worthy, it plays into your emotional well-being. And so it's very challenging personally to look at why you didn't get what you wanted, why this did not succeed, why this didn't, well, I shouldn't say succeed, why it didn't meet your goals, why it didn't give you the outcome that you had intended.
Why shouldn't you say succeed?
Because in the failure, you learn how to do something better. And that sometimes is a bigger success.
Yeah.
And a really good example is I've been trying for this residency. It's a 3-month residency in the Midwest. And I've been applying for 10 years and I haven't gotten it. And I keep thinking, why? Well, I realize that my work just isn't as, doesn't push some of the boundaries that this residency tends to look for. And I've also changed my goals. I don't know if I'd want to live 3 months outside of my house, my husband, my family, all of that now. 10 years ago, it was easier. Now I'm not so sure. So there's realignment of my goals. So I learned so much about where my work is that's a success in and of itself, even though I never got that residency.
Yeah.
Success is a funny place. So I say, reach your goals,
Interesting. Okay. So you have skirted around this word, but I think it's important to talk about the difference between failure and rejection, because you were rejected from, your application was rejected. But yeah, so tell us what you mean when you look at those two words. Like, how do they differ for you?
Rejection is from the outside. I'm not accepted into this program, or I wasn't selected at this moment. That's a rejection because I had no control over that. It wasn't my decision. And failure is internally judging where I'm at in alignment with my goals.
Okay.
And someone else can define failure. If I selected the cheaper shipping company and they shipped something and a piece broke off of it, that's a failure too, but that's out of my control. And that's a problem that I kind of have to deal with and say, okay, so why did I pick the cheaper shipping company that didn't spend all the money on the bubble wrap, which, by the way, happened. I get a piece and they're like, oh yeah, 4 pieces fell off in shipping and there was a hole in the cardboard box. Yeah, that's a lot of shame and embarrassment and humiliation. And how do I correct it when I'm here in New Jersey and the piece is in Texas? And I think, I should have trusted my intuition and paid the extra money to have it shipped properly. So sometimes failure can come from the outside, but again, it originated with my lack of spending that extra money, being greedy to say, I'm not going to spend the extra $200 on shipping. Now I'm left with that responsibility.
I'm guessing you don't do that anymore.
No.
Failure is easier to take when you feel supported and when you have the tools to get back on your feet again. I'm confident I can give you this in the Art Biz Success programs. We have vibrant community conversations, live Zoom connections, and hundreds of lessons. Please don't worry. You only need to do one lesson at a time for progress, and you can only do one lesson at a time. If it's safe for you to do so, pause this podcast now and visit artbizsystem.com to see how we, and I do mean we because it's not just me, can help. That's artbizsystem.com. After teaching art marketing and business building strategies for nearly 2 decades, I know I have a solution for you. Find out more, prepare for the new art season at artbizsystem.com. You told us that you look back and try to be objective about why something didn't work out as you had planned. Are there other ways that you process failure? Like, I guess that's tied up with this other question also. At one point, do you say that was a failure, or, yeah, and I'm giving up, or that was a mistake and I'll do better next year?
When it changes, when your goals change, when what you want changes, you set goals, you have a vision in your mind of where you want to be with your career. And when those begin to change, then your direction changes and you sometimes need to shift. And I'll say the residency, it's Bemis residency in Omaha, Nebraska. And I really, really wanted to be there because they have huge studios, and
I've been there. Yes.
And they have woodworking studios. They have woodworking equipment, which is a rarity at residencies. And, there's so few places that I have the opportunity to go to do woodworking. And for some reason, literally, I think I even visited them to figure out what was I doing wrong on my application. And they said, well, we have different judges every year. And, every year I looked at it, and every year I applied with the continuation of an evergreen project, the continuation of my current body of work, instead of pushing those boundaries. And, I realize that now, so that rejection told me that I'm not doing something timely. I'm not doing something pushing limits. And all those failures and all those rejections made me take more classes on grant writing. I signed up for your grant writing classes and, how to prepare your mastermind classes. The Creative Council provides opportunities for grants. So I wouldn't have done all that extra learning had I gotten in. But now it changed because I don't want to be 3 months out of my house. So those goals have changed, and I'm not so sure that I want to push the boundaries that they were looking for anymore. I'm quite happy continuing with where I want. It's in alignment with my goals and values at this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there a moment where you have a pity party for yourself, that you kick and scream, that you throw things, that you cry, or do you just dust yourself off and keep going?
Oh, no. Let me tell you, a lot of pity parties. And it usually happen in the shower. Crying in the shower is just great. It just washes everything away. Exercise is another great one. It's all like fat crying, when you're up on that bike and you're spinning and just sweating. I'm like, yeah, we're crying from every possible pore in my body right now. You got to let it go, and you got to have that pity party. You've got to comfort, that little child that's really hurt from all these rejections, because they're in there, especially in this field, and especially if you've been doing this since you were small. It's attached to everything, your identity, who you are, and it's huge. So when you get those big failures, it's, like I said, it's tied to shame, and that's a real hard thing to talk about.
Yeah, it's just so vital, though, that we accept failure as part of the process of growth. It's not 10 years ago, I wrote a post about how I don't believe in failure. I believe the only failure is not trying your best, as you were saying earlier. But I think it's semantics, how some people consider mistakes failures and so forth. And there's just no way to have any progress if you're not failing, if you're not falling down. You don't learn to ride a bike. This is so cliche, but you don't learn to ride a bike right off. You have to fall down I remember those scraped knees. You have to fall down a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, I could have continued to do local juried shows and only applied to local art councils or art alliances the rest of my life and have been very successful. And I wouldn't have been happy. So I could have found easy ways to have had success and never have challenged my growth. But I think that's inherent in who I am, because I keep going back to school to try to learn how to do something better, and not better, just more within alignment of my voice with where I want to be. So, I want those challenges. I reach for the I don't reach for the low hanging fruit. I'm going for the top. And that's a huge reach. I may need a lot of help. And if you think of it like that, you need community, you need friends, both in and out of this industry. A lot of those pity parties I do not do with other artists. I'll go to lunch with somebody that's not even in my field, that barely even knows I am an artist and thinks it's just so glamorous, because I don't want to talk about it, but I need that respite, that there is another world out there, and that can heal you to move on and to pick up again and to do it again.
Why don't you talk about it with other artists?
I do talk about it with other artists, but sometimes because it's so hurtful to talk about it. There's that shame again. I failed. You're succeeding. I failed. It's a conversation that needs to be had, because they have their failures too. But it also lines up comparison. And sometimes I don't want a comparison. If I'm really hurting over a rejection, and I know that you just got accepted to something that I also wanted, that really stings. So I prefer to talk about it with my non-art friends, and they tend to be more objective. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't talk about it with art friends, but I'm more likely to talk about it outside of my field.
Okay. I wonder if there's a time. Because I would think that the artist would really get it. I would think that not everyone is in a field where they get rejected as much as artists get rejected, as many frustrations as artists have, especially if they're fully employed by someone else, some corporation or something. And I would think that artists really get it. And so I find that interesting. I also think it's just probably a matter of personality. Like some people are really sharing that way and some people just aren't.
No, and I shared it a lot with my friend from graduate school. And because we'd gone through those heartaches, she had already seen me cry. She'd already seen, me lose my temper at a man. She'd seen it all. And so it's easy to have those conversations with somebody who's experienced it. A lot of your artist friends have not seen those moments, the ugly side of the making. And maybe that's just something maybe I need to start sharing with, so it's not a heavy burden to carry, because they are burdens to carry.
I think that some people haven't experienced it because they haven't stepped out. They haven't stepped out of their comfort zone. They don't want to fail. And so they don't take these risks that are absolutely necessary for progress and growth. And so you don't hear about that because they're not failing forward.
Yeah. And it's part of the culture, the Instagram culture, where everything is so beautiful and perfect and lovely, and even mistakes are curated. Even the bad days are curated, and there's this falsity. And I guess maybe it is a responsibility that I'm so willing to share this on a podcast publicly now, that I can maybe have these conversations that, I really screw up and I've really lost some big opportunities.
Well, there's probably also some time, some space between your last big failure and the moment we're recording this, that you're willing to talk about it. I imagine that helps a little.
Yeah, it does. It does.
What does it look like? So that's kind of both a business failure and an artistic failure. That when you gave the example of the Bemis residency, it's an example of your art goals. I wouldn't actually even call that a failure. That's just your art goals not being in alignment with what they're doing. Like, you're not reading the fine print.
Well, I don't know. I mean, 9 times I applied. I've read a lot of fine print. I even went out there to visit them. I drove, I was in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so I drove an hour and I set up this appointment and I was like, why am I not getting this, And so now there's another residency that I apply to frequently. It's closer to home. But yeah, I'll just keep trying. And I know it's the most competitive one in the country. It's the McDowell residency. I don't know if I'll ever be worthy enough to go up there, but yeah, I'll just keep applying. Let's see what happens. Maybe something else will change. Maybe I'll get it when I'm 90. Maybe they'll just take pity on me. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with pity.
Well, I hope they're listening, and yeah. So it's a failure, not necessarily of not reading the fine print, but just of you seeing that that's not what you wanted. Not like you said, not being in alignment with what they wanted. Not the McDowell, but the Bemis.
Yeah. And Allison, it has to do with going back and looking at the research. Who got in and where did the careers wind up? What is it that they were making before that residency and after? What has been, and they were all newer projects. And like I said, it only took going through grant writing, reading books on how to write a better grant, taking workshops to learn that residencies are looking for timely and new projects that push boundaries, not necessarily evergreen projects or a continuation of projects. Mm-hmm. And had I not applied, 9 times, and I'm totally embarrassed to say that even now, but had I not gone through that, I wouldn't have learned that. But then that makes my next projects bigger. And when I wrote the artist statement for the Massachusetts Cultural Council, I knew to submit things that were more timely. And the pieces that I submitted for the fellowship that I received were pieces that dealt with COVID. And I don't think I would have done that consciously had I not taken all those grant writing classes that made me fail 9 times. So I may not necessarily have gotten into Bemis residency, but that education pushed me forward somewhere else.
Well, we should say that was a successful grant application, and you were awarded that just not too long ago.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. Yeah, just in May.
So that was one lesson that you learned. Are there any other lessons that stick out in your memory that you've learned from failures?
Oh, well, photographing my work professionally was my first one. Researching shipping companies was another. And this is a great example of listening to your intuition and not getting in your own way. Years and years ago, when I was studying pastels and still painting traditionally, I had an opportunity to meet Wolf Kahn, who was this, world-renowned pastel artist. But I was so concerned with my husband running late, and he wasn't dressed appropriately. He was a gym teacher, so he was in, sneakers and a warm-up suit. And we were going to this cocktail party thing in New York. And I was all in my nonsense with, do I look right? He doesn't look right. Now we're late. And all that stuff that gets in your head. And I missed an opportunity to speak with him. And my husband wound up speaking with him because he didn't have any of the stuff that you carry, all your anxieties and your nervousness and insecurities. So he met him. I got into his class. I was so thrilled and so happy. But if I didn't watch my husband just put aside insecurities and just take the moment and live in that moment, I wouldn't have had that opportunity to take a class with Wolf Kahn. So listening to your intuition, honoring who you are is so important in being successful, and that was a huge failure that I couldn't introduce myself. Like, what kind of person am I? I'm so messed up in my own head. I can't I'm in my own way. That I couldn't meet this person, and it took somebody else to teach me that.
Yeah.
So that was another. big failure, that I couldn't do it on my own. But I learned.
Well, but your success is that you recognized it and you learned from it, like you said. Yeah.
And that's so important. And that takes time. And in our mastermind class, I likened it to, athletic training. When you're trying to get your body to do something, it needs rest and nutrition and practice. And art is very much the same way. You need practice. You need to look at your what are you doing? How can you improve? And it's not a comparison to others. It's your own value system, your own looking at it. I don't know. I don't know if I'm making sense anymore.
It's growth, right? So you're comparing it to yourself. So if you haven't grown as an artist from where you were last year or the year before, so I think it's very fair to compare it to yourself, to your previous self, because that's what, art is all about, a lifelong pursuit of, all artists will say their favorite work is their last work, right? It's because they see how they improved upon it. And I just don't know how you could be an artist without failing a lot, or own any business, right? Without taking chances, without taking risks, without making progress.
Yeah. And there are little mistakes too. When I first started with the woodworking, I was using wood glue. Obviously, you're gluing wood to wood. What else would you use? Wood glue. But it wasn't sticking. And I was getting so frustrated because the pieces would just they would dry. I'd hang them up and poof, pop, off they went. And I'm like, wow, what is going on? So I had to go and look at it. So I went and I talked to people. I talked to old time woodworkers and they said, oh, you got to sand. Okay, so I go out and I buy a sander, and I learned to sand. It's still happening. Wood to wood, still not gluing. It's still doing funny things. So my husband says, well, why don't it's boat wood, because that's what I started with first. He goes, why don't you go to a boat store and ask them what kind of glue they use for boats? And I did. And wow, now I use a marine glue, which is so much stronger than any other wood glue. And it has to do with moisture content, which I learned a lot about and all this other stuff. But, it's in these daily mistakes that if you don't learn, you're going to have big failures. I think mistakes are like the little stepping stones to something humongous. I associate failure with huge, but you have to constantly question, where do you want to be and how do I get there? And what am I doing or not doing? And sometimes that kind of clarity takes time.
Well, and I love the fact that you said you talked to people. You weren't afraid. You weren't too proud to ask. You weren't afraid to say, hey, this isn't working. And then just follow that trail so that it's like I tell my clients, like, if you really want to do something, you'll figure out how to do it. That's not the hard part. You Google it. Right? You Google it, you Google who to talk to or whatever it is. And you have to be willing to do that. But some people, I don't know if women are more apt to ask those kinds of questions and men just prefer to think that, I don't know, maybe it's just the men in my life. I'm not sure. But I feel like I'm like way more open to asking questions and admitting that I don't know how to do something than my husband is, or my dad, or my brother, or something like that. But that curiosity is just essential to all of this. Oh my gosh, we've used so many good words today. Laura, what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Hopefully no big failures, because I have a solo show coming up. I have a solo show this fall at the New England Quilt Museum, and I'm pretty excited to have this one. This is my first one since I've moved to New England in this area. So I'm thrilled.
When does that open?
October 5th, and it runs through December 30th.
Awesome. I look forward to following along with that. Laura, thank you so much for joining me on the Art Biz podcast.
Sure. My pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Laura Petrovich Cheney. See her art at lauracheney.com and follow her on Instagram at Laura Petrovich Cheney. To see photos, read the show notes, and leave a comment for Laura or me, visit Art Biz Podcast and look for episode 95. If you're a committed artist looking for the how-tos of running a profitable art business and the community and coaching support to back that up, read about my programs and join us at artbizsystem.com. And do follow me on Instagram, where I'm currently live every Wednesday. I'm at Allison Stanfield. Music for the Art Biz Podcast is by Wilderness. Thank you for listening, and thanks for your trust.